So I'd like to thank everyone for remaining here until the last session of the day. I hope we'll keep your attention. Let me start though by adopting the acknowledgement to country from the previous speakers and pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambia people. Pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that acknowledgement to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people either here today or online. And with that, may I also acknowledge everyone who's tuning in online as well. So the session today is renewable energy-based exports. Do we need an Australian Inflation Reduction Act? And by way of introduction, my name's Marcus Priest. I work at the Department of Finance, primarily focused on climate and energy budget policy. But for the last 6 months, I've been working at the Net Zero Economy Agency, helping to establish the Net Zero Economy Authority. Never forget the economy. And before that, I've worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet on energy policy, and also worked on the Finkel Review. And then many years before that, I worked at the Financial Review as a climate and energy writer. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which we've heard a bit about today, it's a subject of intense interest within government and also outside government as well. It was a signature policy signed into law last year by President Biden in the United States. It provided around 500 billion Australian of grants, loans and production subsidies for clean energy industries. It provoked, as Frank outlined earlier, something of a clean energy arms race with countries around the world, Canada, the trading bloc EU, announcing complementary investments. In Australia, in this year's budget, we saw the announcement of the $2 billion Hydrogen Head Start program, which will provide revenue support for green hydrogen projects. And there was also some money allocated for work to analyse the implications for Australia of intensifying global competition for clean energy industry. However, in November, and this was something that Frank reflected in his speech, the Treasurer outlined what an Australian response might look like. And he was very clear to indicate that it would complement, not copy, the priorities and plans of other nations, and not do exactly the same kind of investment with exactly the same kind of subsidies. Rather, it would be focused on Australia's strengths, on renewable energy resources, our reputation as a trusted and reliable trading partner. So what does that mean? What does that mean for Australia? That's something the panel will be addressing today. We've got 4 very good speakers. Let me start with the first speaker. That's Associate Professor Emma Aisbett from the ANU College of Law, Associate Director, the ANU Grand Challenge Zero Carbon Energy for Asia Pacific. Welcome. Have we got the order wrong? Okay. Change of plans. Let me start with Associate Professor Fiona Beck. Fiona's told me not to read her whole bio because it would be very intimidating. Other than to say she's the co-lead of the Renewable Fuel Research Group, convener of the Hydrogen Fuels Project of the ANU College of Law, ANU College of Engineering, Computing and Cybernetics.
Yes, so one of the reasons that I was so keen to go first is because I'm going to somewhat set the scene. Am I going backwards? Yes, I am, but it wasn't going forwards. There we go. So very quickly, I've been convening the hydrogen project from the Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific Grand Challenge for the last 5 years. So everything that I'm about to say is really the evolution of lots and lots of conversations from experts at ANU in a range of disciplines. And I've been very, very privileged to be part of that project. and now be standing here able and invited to talk about this sort of thing with you all. So I think it's important to, keep firmly in mind what we're trying to achieve here, right? And the net zero by 2050 is difficult, as we've seen, difficult and possible. And I think we've heard a lot today about how the energy sector is absolutely critical, right? We really need to worry about where our electricity is coming from, but it's not the only thing we need to worry about. And even though most of the reductions in emissions that we need to happen by 2030 will come from technologies that are already on the market. We've heard about those: solar, wind, batteries, EVs. All of these are already going gangbusters, and that's exactly what they should be doing. However, to get to 2050, we are going to need reductions from technologies that aren't yet on the market. And that's really what I'm going to be touching on here. So we've seen the emissions profile, the global emissions profile, in a number of different forms today. Here's yet another one. But to point out here that the electricity and heat sector is a really critical part, but it's not all of it, right? And in that, I'm giving it all away. Within that, you also have industry sitting in there. And we have transport, we have industry as another big block outside of heat and electricity. And in particular, we've got ammonia, which is a critical chemical for us, right? We need it to make fertilizers and a whole range of other products. If you combine that with iron and steel making, we're looking at about 5% of that total 24% from industry, right? So that's a big chunk that we need to think about. And shipping and aviation, that's about 3% of that 15% from transport. So why am I picking on those particular industries? Well, those are industries that are not necessarily going to benefit from direct electrification. We can't just electrify shipping containers. We can't electrify really big planes yet, if ever, because of the energy to weight ratios. And we need to be able to make steel, chemicals, ammonia in sustainable ways and replace fossil fuels. And this is where this is why you're hearing about hydrogen so much, because hydrogen is this link between electricity and chemicals. So you can start with electrolysis, you can do a number of other different chemical synthesis, adding either nitrogen from the air or carbon dioxide, to get a whole range of really critical feedstocks and commodities, and critically displacing the fossil fuels that are currently used there. So green metals is another one that you might have come across. And this is a really big thing in Australia. The idea of this is that instead of using coal for the reduction of iron ore to drag out all that oxygen from the iron ore, we can use hydrogen instead. And we can also use the hydrogen to provide the high temperatures that are needed. Similarly, with aluminium, at the moment, we burn a lot to provide the electricity and the heat required. We can do that renewably. And just a quick plug, there's the current HILT CRC, which ANU is an important part of, who's doing a lot of really interesting work in this area. So what should Australia be concentrating on? Well, this was mentioned by others, and Frank included. We really need to be looking at value-added commodities, right? What can we do onshore with our renewable energy resources to make all sorts of important critical feedstocks and commodities that can be sold on the export market and can really help us to decarbonize not only ourselves, but our region and potentially beyond that. So these are, of course, things like ammonia, other chemicals, metals, bunkering and aviation fuels, very important, and mining. And really nicely to see that the review of the hydrogen strategy, which is currently underway, and there was a consultation earlier in the year, they really are, there is now this consensus that that's what we should be focusing on. So it was really great to see that. But competition, we are not the only people in the world that are thinking about this, and we are definitely not the only people in the world that have good solar resources, right? And I don't have a wind map, and I couldn't find a combined one, which was a bit disappointing. But I think this really nicely visually shows you that although we're a nice deep red color over a very large portion of our landmass, there are other places in the world that are also close to critical markets that have very red bits, right? And in fact, there has been some work out of CSIRO highlighting that if you want to focus on if you want to look at the average renewable energy cost as an indicator of competitiveness, we're currently, whoops, oh no, my animations have gone, never mind. The critical point here is that we are sitting third in that list behind India and China. And critically, Australia is going to be dependent on shipping, right? There's no way that we are going to be able to sell hydrogen or chemicals through pipelines. So we're going to be constrained by what we can put on a ship. And that is going to add cost to our supply chains for things like renewable hydrogen and derivatives. However, even with that, Frank, highlighted the other advantages that we have, the closeness to the Asia Pacific region, and also the fact that we have this very, very large area of land that we can use to provide our renewable energy, which is really quite unique, right? There's very few other places in the world that have this very large landmass with the very low population and energy requirements that we're going to need domestically. And this gives us the opportunity to focus on a really strong renewably driven export industry. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I'm going to start by saying we categorically need an Australian response to the US Inflation Reduction Act. As Marcus said, the US IRA has created a global race to the top, a massive investment and technology investment. And the response is staggering, but when you throw $1 trillion of subsidies on the table, that generally tends to change the world dynamics. But what I would say is China is a decade ahead of the West, and we need to understand their response to the IRA has been to go twice as fast. So let's not underestimate China's global leadership in every zero emissions technology and industry of the future. And so how we respond, and again, Marcus quoted the Treasurer, complement, not copy foreign policies, and we need to think strategically. We are a relatively small economy. I think we undercook we massively underestimate our global significance. We play #1 in the world in iron ore. We play #1 in the world in coking coal. We play #1 in the world in lithium, #1 in the world in LNG, #2 in the world in thermal coal. We're not a bit player. We're a world leader when it comes to mining and energy. So we need to think strategically because the opportunities for our economy are enormous. The threats to our economy are also enormous. As a petro state, as Dr. Finkel talks about, we need to pivot our economy so that we are aligned with the needs the world has of the future, not the past. And so I think we do need to think about China's massive technology leadership and their response. Like, they are doubling their manufacturing capacity in solar and in batteries and EVs every 2 years. How you double your capacity, only the Chinese can think that strategically. CATL, the biggest battery company in the world, 35% global market share, one company, barely existed a decade ago. It's spending $2 billion a year on R&D. Now, I don't know if you ever looked at Exxon or Chevron or Woodside or Santos's accounts, but their R&D spend is close to zero, whereas CATL is spending $2 billion a year. Trina Solar, Jinko Solar spend 5, 6, 7% of revenue every year on R&D. So China's not stuffing around. They're not going to let the Americans catch up, having watched the Americans drop the ball for a decade. they're going to run twice as fast. So we've got to think strategically. We can't just throw money against subsidies and think that's going to win. The Chinese are decimating the solar price as we speak. It's down 40%, solar module prices down 40% in the last 12 months. That's because China has just built enough capacity to make the IEA forecast for solar installs by 2030 out by 100%, right? They will be producing 1,000 gigawatts a year of solar modules this decade, and the IEA thinks the 2030 number globally will be 500 or 600 gigawatts. So the world is underestimating the Chinese dominance, the technology, and to me, strategic partnerships are the answer. I do think Australia has a globally significant role to play. We can be a renewable energy powered mining superpower. We need to have a price on carbon. We need to encourage China to have a price on carbon, Korea and Japan. So I think we should be embracing the CBAM that Europe's got. I think China should embrace the CBAM, and that will then enforce us to provide the products they want. And to put a price on carbon means we can then export embodied decarbonisation, which is the critical advantage Australia's got. We've got the best wind and solar resource in the world. We've got more land you can poke a stick at. We've got brilliant capital markets. We are a trusted energy supplier to this Asian region. We should be actually embodying decarbonisation powered by renewables by value-adding our resources before we export them. And that is the multi-$100 billion a year opportunity for Australia. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd make some interesting disagreements as we did at the panel we looked at last week. But unfortunately, I largely agree. So my speech is going to be very boring now. So the question our panel was posed was, do we need an Australian Inflation Reduction Act? The answer is pretty clearly probably not. And I think actually everyone agrees on that, at least not in that form. Do we need green industrial policy? I think we actually all agree the answer is probably a big yes to that. So why do we need green industrial policy, or why do we need to do green industrial policy? So because everyone else is doing it. Have you ever tried coming to your mum as a kid with that answer? She probably muttered something about a bridge people were jumping off. So yeah, once again, that's not the reason to do it, and it's not going to work, as Tim said, for Australia. But taking a sort of neoclassical economic approach to green industrial policy, there are two reasons that one might undertake green industrial policy. One is because you can't manage to do the first best thing of putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions. And indeed, that's probably the kindest interpretation of the design of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's sort of technology non-specific production subsidies. That's not something you could justify in many ways, except via the idea that it's politically impossible in the US to put a price on carbon. So instead use taxpayer money to subsidize people to produce products that will displace some of those more emitting products. That might be an option in the US, which of course has a huge internal market, but as the theme of this panel suggests, Australia really matters globally in its export profile in terms of emissions. So for Australia to do that, it would be Australian taxpayers subsidising emissions reductions in the rest of the world. If that's mum and dad's, might not go down too well politically, although I have to admit, if that's fossil fuel revenues, maybe that is a fair thing for us to be doing. So what is the third reason that we might think about industrial policy? And that is something economists refer to as first best or optimal industry policy applied to green industries. So industries, as we know, particularly high risk new industries, face a lot of what economists refer to as market failures. Things that mean that government intervention, quite the opposite of distorting markets, can actually improve efficiency and help us to get better outcomes and better welfare. And so this is one of the few reasons, market failures is one of the few reasons you'll ever hear an economist say governments should get involved in things. And there are certainly very many market failures that affect green industries. One example that I'm very much involved with is that it's very hard for consumers to know, in fact, impossible for consumers to know when they're buying a product, what the embedded emissions, what emissions were associated with the production of that product. That's hard for investors, it's hard for consumers. So how can governments help to address that market failure? They can do what the Australian government is currently doing with a much smaller price tag than $1 trillion. Currently, I think there's around $13.5 million in the budget for the Guarantee of Origin scheme. What about credit constraints? We know that particularly for new industries, it can be hard to get credit at a reasonable price because there's a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty in those markets. Once again, a good justification for green banks, and in Australia's case, that's the CEFC. There are coordination failures, once again, particularly important for Australia if we're looking to export. So once again, new supply chains have a lot of chicken and egg problems. Are we going to be exporting ammonia? Are we going to be exporting liquefied hydrogen? We need to figure that out in conjunction with our trading partners. And this is where another form of industry policy that I have been researching comes in, and that is international green economy collaborations. So this is where we sit down with our trading partners and figure out, how are we going to organise our supply chains? How are we going to do the embedded emissions accounting? And can we pool our resources with regard to research and development and align them and maybe have some global impact? So all of these reasons are good reasons for green industrial policy and good things that the Australian government is already doing. I will finish on one last point. It's a little thing that economists refer to as dynamic external economies of scale. In other words, learning by doing, which we know is hugely important in new industries. And that's all fine, and you don't need government intervention if the companies doing that learning can hang on to that learning for themselves and benefit from it. However, when you have what's called knowledge spillovers, like your workers wander off and go and work in China or the US, then you potentially have a problem. And I will admit that in terms of that jumping off the bridge, kind of everybody else is doing it, dynamic economies of scale and the potential for Australia to be left behind on that front is possibly potentially a discussable justification for some production subsidies. Thank you.
It's looking for the stage, the last speaker from the Brian, principal Burke, head of the Arndt-Corden in economics and deputy director of the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy.
All right, good evening, everyone. Great to see you here for the session. In my 5 minutes, I thought I would identify two key aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act and talk about them with relevance to Australia. And in particular, here we're thinking about Australia's potential for large clean energy export industries, clean commodity exports. The two key elements of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, in no particular order. Number one, encouraging onshoring via domestic content requirements. The Inflation Reduction Act has requirements and gives preference to domestic production and procurement, and also what is called friendshoring. So the supply of commodities such as minerals from friendly countries as well. Number two, tax credits for clean production and also clean consumption as well. So for example, there's a tax credit for green hydrogen production. There's also one for EV purchases as well. But it is reliant on the domestic content meeting the requirements too. I'm going to make the argument, number one here is not a good way to go for Australia in terms of trying to force through local production of many different commodities. Australia is a very different country to the United States. And for us, I don't think that would work. For the US, we could talk about that further as well. Number two, broad tax credits or subsidies. I'm also going to argue they are best avoided. However, we do need to be really ambitious in our policy settings to be bringing in a lot of investment into this very exciting industry. So first of all, on the first point, and summarizing it via the term onshoring. Many of the IRA measures, if we look into them, they do include domestic content requirements. Onshoring is much less desirable for a country like Australia. We're not the smallest economy in the world, but we are only 1.6% of world GDP. The United States, of course, is a much larger place, a much bigger economy. They carry out more activities across their economy than we do and we ever will. Australia also, relative to the United States, is a trading nation as well. Our economy is increasingly integrated with countries in the region in particular. We're an Asia-Pacific trading country. We benefit a lot from the international economic system that Australia has spent many years contributing towards building up. We benefit from regional economic integration and an open international trading system and institutions such as the World Trade Organization. Protectionist aspects of the IRA, it should also be noted, they are potentially subject to challenge at the World Trade Organization. So I would be recommending against going down the protectionist route and requiring things such as battery production in Australia to qualify for subsidies when someone buys an EV. But let's talk about the second point now, which is broad-based tax credits or subsidies. As mentioned already in the talks, Australia's main role here really is as a commodity supplier to the Asia Pacific. The key is for us to be working very closely with our great friends in the Asia Pacific for them to be having very ambitious emissions reduction, renewables adoption targets. And for Australia to be a partner with them. So a facilitative, reliable and safe partner for trade and investment. We need a huge flow of capital investment into Australia to be realizing these dreams of becoming a clean energy powerhouse. I think powerhouse is a more modest term than superpower. It's key for us to be providing that investment environment. This can be done though without providing broad across the commodities subsidies for clean production. And I do think it's a good thing that Treasurer did use a lot of nuance in his speech about the IRA and called for a uniquely Australian approach rather than just copying what the United States has done here. So what is the way to go if I'm arguing we don't need broad production tax credits or subsidies? There's a lot to it and I didn't want to put too much on my slide. But there are big spending needs and opportunities for Australian government, state and federal. It would tend to be, I think, a better idea to be focusing those on capital investments. So improving transmission infrastructure, the Australian government is prioritising that already. Also port infrastructure. There are some common user ports and wharves that could potentially be improved by Australian state or federal governments, and that would involve ownership, and that is a different approach to just subsidizing production or giving tax credits per unit of something like green hydrogen production. Adopt a strengthened carbon price, this has already been mentioned, but also work with neighbours to encourage them to be doing likewise. Australia really hurt the regional cause and moved towards carbon pricing when we removed our own carbon pricing scheme and talked very negatively about carbon pricing for some years. The third point on here, domestically, we need to be moving to renewables as quickly as possible. And so we have a target there. We can talk about the best way to achieve it, but making sure that we convert our domestic electricity system to clean electricity as quickly as possible is a good way to go. Targeted co-investments. It is a good idea for the Australian government, if it is to be intervening here fiscally, to be making sure that there's a return to the Australian people. And one way to do that is via co-investments. Co-investments pass a market test. The private sector's investing, the Australian government is as well. Of course, we're doing that already with the CEFC. Really what we need is a lot of investment. And so we move into the world of corporate income tax reform. This is not an energy specific topic. There are different models for corporate income tax reform. One of the models out there is called the Allowance for Corporate Equity Approach, ACE. The nickname is much cooler than the full name. This is an approach which tries to incentivize investment, and while doing so, also making sure that profitable companies will be paying corporate income tax. The idea is to shift corporate income tax collections towards taxing super profits and away from taxing very marginal profits. There are other approaches. Professor Roscano has an alternative, which is a cash flow-based tax proposal. I think the allowance for corporate equity approach is pretty attractive, and I do commend a recent report by the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute here at ANU on exactly this topic, a big report on corporate income tax reform. Final point here, and similar to what has been already made, is work closely with our Asia Pacific partners. There's a lot of work to do to make sure that secure power purchase agreements, or commodity purchase agreements in particular, are signed for some of these large export projects in Australia and with Asia Pacific partners. Thank you very much.
So I've been very questions from the audience, but also online. And if you're online, please drop your questions into the Zoom messages facility. While you're thinking of a question, can I start, I guess, with maybe the elephant in the room, thinking about some of the presentations we've had earlier, particularly the last one, in terms of the challenges faced with the domestic transition. If we're going to become, and to use the catchphrase, a renewable energy superpower, what are the implications in terms of not only making the domestic transition, but also providing all that additional green energy for green energy exports, but also resources with embedded green energy in terms of the land, in terms of the power, in terms of the social license? What are the challenges for becoming that renewable energy superpower? Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks. So yeah, one of the interesting, so I'm going to attack this, as I said, from an engineering lens. So one of the interesting things about thinking about Australia's domestic energy systems with all of these extra power needs on top of it from the exports is that it completely changes our demand profile, right? So if you imagine that we don't just need to provide 100% of our domestic load in clean electricity, we might actually have to provide 200%, 300%, 700%, I've heard as numbers as well, right? So that essentially changes very drastically the way that your demand is going to vary during the year. It also potentially gives you a fantastic way to soak up renewable energy when it's cheap. You ramp up your electrolyzers, you ramp up any other of your industrial processes that you can. And when potentially your power is a little bit more challenging, like when you have a wet week in winter and with no wind, then you could potentially pay export industries to ramp down slightly. And this could actually really help us in cheaply meeting a really reliable and stable renewable energy grid. I'd like to just say one other thing. Water was already talked about. Kylie mentioned how, you know, in the power sector for renewables, water, the volume of water you need is not that big compared with what we already use in fossil fuel power production. That's not true for hydrogen production. And it's not true for hydrogen production from fossil fuels either, by the way. They use a lot of, I mean, you're still getting your hydrogen from a mix of water and fossil fuels, right? It's really water intensive. And we've done some calculations that if you wanted to produce enough renewable energy to sort of match the energy that we already export in terms of coal and gas, then you would need something in the region of 8% of Australia's water, right? So we cannot do this with fresh water. It needs to be desalination, and that needs to be something that government regulates. So I'll stop there.
Maybe just building on that, we are talking about the decarbonisation of the energy system to power both our domestic market and our exports. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of investment So rather than being necessarily just a problem, it's hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. That is an opportunity to rebuild our economy and grow it. I'm thinking specifically, at the moment, we're trying to decarbonise our domestic electricity system. We're trying to do it close to the cities. We're trying to build the renewable energy zones a bit further out from the cities. We haven't built the transmissioners yet. But think about the Pilbara and the opportunities, Mount Isa, the land opportunities in far north Queensland and in the Pilbara. There's not quite as many social license to operate. And if you're deploying, let me just pick a number out of the air, $400 billion of new investment, you could probably actually give the traditional owners a little bit of equity in that project so that they actually have a financial incentive to endorse and support it rather than just get screwed by it. So if we actually tried a little more forward-thinking strategy of inclusive investment, I'll just finish by saying, like BHP last year, 62% of their energy came from imported, high emissions, really expensive diesel, 62%, our leading company in the country, and 1% came from renewables. So let's think about decarbonising the mining sector and building the refining assets where the power is actually going to be, and think about the massive investment opportunities. It's a massive opportunity at the moment. We've got the Murdoch media smashing us over the head every day with social license. Maybe we need to think a bit more strategically about land use and where we put those resources. And think of Copper String 2 up in far north Queensland to actually activate huge tracts of land where maybe the farmers would be quite happy to be paid millions and millions of dollars a year to rent their land out for having some turbines on it.
Just to add, I agree with all of that. Just to add briefly on subsidies, Australia over the years has been a big beneficiary of overseas subsidies. The Germans subsidised solar PV, the Chinese as well. So that's great news actually for us from a consumption point of view. Now we have solar rooftop as a result of that, and as a result of all of the research and development in China and Australia and elsewhere. So I think a key thing for Australia is just remember our role in the regional economy and global economy. We can't produce everything. Sometimes we can really benefit from these subsidies overseas.
Hi all, thanks. It's Will Howard here from the Climate Change Authority. I wanted to go back to an issue that Frank brought up in his initial talk, which is not an export as such, but he referred to Australia's opportunity to be a carbon removalist. And I wanted to get the panel's reflections on how you might envision that being applied as an industry. Would that be, we take tanker loads of CO2 from Japan and Korea and sequester it? Or would it be more cost effective to, say, export blue hydrogen where you've applied steam reforming to methane with CCS? And how would you see an industry like that, which is not an export in and of itself, playing out?
That's a really good question. I'd like to make it absolutely clear, though, that we are not being carbon removalists if we are making blue hydrogen, and we are not being carbon removalists if we're taking hydrogen from industrial processes from other countries and burying it. That is at best abatement. So that's a whole interesting and potentially something we're going to have to do, but it's not the same as removing it. So it's just really clear that the challenges in shipping around a tanker full of carbon dioxide or even a tanker full of hydrogen are really complicated, right? And that's one of the reasons why Australia, there seems to be this consensus now that Australia is pivoting towards these value-added commodities where we're using our renewable energy, we're using hydrogen from that to make things that are easier to ship, like green metals, like ammonia. And if we can do it just as cheaply with renewable energy, then don't touch any of the CCS, right? CCU, carbon capture and utilization, where you're taking it out of the atmosphere and using it, that is an important technology that we haven't really got our hands around yet. Direct air capture is ridiculously energy intensive. And so I have to give you the context. I'm currently developing technologies to make things like ethylene out of atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's one of my day jobs, so I am a little bit biased in this, right? But I do think that's where the technology development is going to happen. You know, we've kind of done what we need to do in solar cells. Now it's an R&D problem, and the same with wind. But I think the next frontier for really cool that technology development is in this area of CCU. Biased opinion, but an opinion nonetheless.
Yeah, when I think of Japan actually taking our LNG, our coking coal, our thermal coal, shipping it all the way over there, burning it, then capturing it, liquefying it, and then shipping it back, and we're going to inject it. Now, they're not going to do it without $100 a tonne price on carbon. We're not going to do it for free. Like, I don't think Santos or Woodside are offering to do CCS for free. So the minute you start to say, okay, Japan's now got to have $100 a tonne price on carbon to actually make what you said work, that's a minimum. Now, I've talked to JIRA about it. They think at least $100 a tonne. That's going to cripple their economy. So I'm all for importing carbon dioxide and liquefying it and having a price signal, because ultimately every other solution becomes energized, commercialized, and 100% more viable than the idea of taking our LNG, or worse, exactly as you said, our blue hydrogen that doesn't exist, shipping it up there and then having them burn it, capture it, liquefy it, bring it back here, and then inject it. And by the way, we're going to measure the whole of life cycle emissions profile on that. How are you going to inject it? Using power, a shitload of power. Chevron can't get Gorgon to work 7 years in a row. It ran 34% last year, 3.2 billion, the biggest CCS project in the world, and Chevron can't get it to work. They can't get it to work because there's no price on carbon. Like $100 a tonne price on carbon, they'll have that facility humming tomorrow.
Can I add on that one a couple of things? One key word I think is social license. As far as I know, we're not big fans of taking our nuclear waste back either. So I think good luck with getting Australian people to be happy about us taking shiploads of carbon dioxide back. The other thing that's been a little economic thought bubbling around in my head for a few years I haven't got around to is if you think about geological storage sites, they are actually a finite resource. So optimal, resource use policy would say you should be having royalties applied to them the same way as you've got royalties on coal or gas coming out of the ground. So I think, that going forward, that's another bit of a price of that activity that should, if we're taking optimal policy, be applied to anyone who is using geological storage for CO2. Once again, to get the right signals so we get the efficient uses of those very important storage resources.
Let me go to a question online. And this is a question for anyone, but Paul, I think probably you could first answer this. What are the prospects of government, either now or in the future, revisiting a carbon price? With an addition, would a fee and dividend approach similar to some Canadian provinces, also supported by James Hansen, for the US be a more acceptable approach to get a price on carbon?
We do have a carbon pricing scheme in Australia under the Safeguard Mechanism and the Emissions Reduction Fund. But that was one of the big reforms recently with the Safeguard Mechanism. That's a baseline and credit emissions trading scheme. Large emitters are given a baseline, and that baseline will be cut year after year. And if they exceed their baseline, they need to buy permits from firms that come in below their baseline. So it is an emissions trading scheme, trading around baselines. There is a carbon price via that. The key thing in Australia in the electricity sector, that essentially doesn't apply, but it could. And that is a potential reform. Why not extend the Safeguard Mechanism so that it's actually working in the electricity sector as well? A mention there of other carbon pricing schemes. It would have been much better if we had just gone for a simple carbon pricing scheme. Like many things, simple is better. A simple carbon tax, or a simple, and a carbon tax and just return as a dividend the revenue, or just a very simple emissions trading scheme would have been preferable. We are where we are, and political communication is is still able to get things through. The safeguard mechanism has just been reformed. So I do still think it is possible in Australia. And of course, if we look around the world, there has been progress on carbon pricing. This year, both Indonesia and Japan have started very nascent emissions trading schemes. And other places such as Singapore, they're increasing their carbon tax. So the story more broadly is not too bad, but we could be doing much better.
Tim, did you want to answer that one?
Sorry, a view on everything. But yes, it would be great if Australia had a carbon price. It would be the economically logical thing to do, a carbon price and dividend, because for every dollar of tax revenue, the government could actually give that out to the consumer of Australia. But I would much rather China had a really high carbon price, because they're our #1 trade partner in the world. And if they had a carbon price, as we were talking to them last week about, and the price was, I don't know, pick a number, 1,000 renminbi, 2,000 renminbi, 3,000 renminbi, that's what they were talking about. Then they might not take our coking coal and an iron ore. They might actually buy our green iron and pay us for it, so that they're not burning our coking coal and having to pay that carbon price in their own economy. The far more important signal for Australia, like I would love Australia to have one. We've got to lead by example, but the power, it's toxic at the moment. So let's have Minister Wong actually go and collaborate with China, Japan, Korea, and get them to have a carbon price. And then that will be a key signal for our industry to decarbonise.
I think there's a question up the back or in the middle.
Jack Pezzi, ANU. Actually, the first part of my question was just been answered. It was about potential for carbon pricing. So the second part is given that there's only very weak carbon pricing at the moment, despite what Paul said, I think it's still pretty weak and incomplete. How much danger is there of picking losers because of the, we've just had a whole afternoon of discussion of all sorts of different industries and technologies in the absence of a really pervasive, strong carbon price. Is there any technologies that the panel would care to name that they think might actually be a waste of money?
It's a great question. Someone like to answer?
Well, a brief answer, I think there's a big risk of picking losers in that Australia will be good at producing some things and maybe extremely good at that, but not so good at other things. And it's very hard to compete in terms of some parts of the global production chain. Some other countries such as Korea are extremely good at producing things like batteries, but we could make a list of other things as well, China and other countries. So Australia should not be trying to compete on all of these things. And yeah, there's a risk of picking some losers along the way, and we won't be the only country exposed to that risk.
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think the current revised hydrogen strategy is headed in the right direction. But I want to say, in terms of green industrial policy, there's people talk about the need for technology competition, and as an economist, more competition is generally a good thing, but that doesn't mean subsidizing an otherwise uncompetitive, polluting form of hydrogen production in order to somehow slow down the gaining of economies of scale for green hydrogen production.
I might go back to a comment Paul made in his formal presentation, which is one of my key recommendations is we need to actually have Australian ownership of Australian industry, or not majority might help, but the idea of using the Future Fund or the CFC or the National Reconstruction Fund to provide not just debt but equity, and therefore maybe retain ownership, majority ownership of Australia's resources. So at the moment, we've actually relying on Gina Reinhardt, Hancock Prospecting. Sorry, I always use Hancock Prospecting to avoid being sued. But in this case, I'm actually complimenting her. She's just intervened twice to stop 2 Australian mining companies being taken over by foreign companies, right? American in this case, not Chinese, but it's the same purpose. So what I'd be arguing, let's not leave it to the government to pick losers. They probably will. Let's give it to the future fund. Like, they are absolute finance experts. They know how to make really good risk-adjusted returns. Let's give them a national interest mandate, maybe a $20 billion portfolio to buy strategic stakes in strategic mining industries. Think about refining. They could actually chuck an extra 100 million, 500 million in an equity investment into a mining company that wants to value add, do a lithium hydroxide factory, to export, embody decarbonisation, value add in Australia. The minute they put a couple $100 million on the table, other private investors will put in a couple $100 million. Maybe we partner with a Japanese firm, a Chinese firm, a Korean firm. They come in and take a strategic stake. Then the banks get crowded in. So all of a sudden $1 gets you $5. And that then gives us a capital return through corporate tax. Sorry to come back to Paul's point. Having Australian-owned entities, majority Australian-owned entities, means they will pay corporate tax in Australia. The minute it's BP, Shell, Chevron, Exxon, Total, they pay no corporate tax. They just use tax havens, and it's a massive competitive disadvantage we exert on Australian-listed companies. They will pay 30 cents in the dollar. Every foreign company operating here pays nothing. Treasury would get a return on that investment through corporate tax if we had majority Australian ownership, and that would then incentivise. So it's not about the government picking losers. Though I agree with you, they probably will. Give it to the experts. I'm biased, I'm from finance. Give it to the finance experts who are already managing $250 billion. Give them another 20 billion and let them get a commercial rate of return, as they have a demonstrated history of doing, but with a national interest objective as well.
We've got limited time left. We've got one question at the back, but I want to get to this question online because this is a fun question. I want to get the panel to respond to this one. What opportunities might there be for nuclear power in Australia in the future?
So I'm a physicist by training, right? I love the idea of nuclear power. It's just so elegant. It's clean. It is clean. You can do all, it's just a beautiful technology, right? So expensive. And it comes back to the way that we've seen technology evolution occur. So putting all the safety and the social license issues aside for a second, let's just talk about the economics, right? One of the reasons that wind and solar have come down that cost curve so quickly are because they're modular. You can make 1,000 of them and tweak it, and make another 1,000 and tweak it, and you can just really improve your processes, cut your costs, learning by doing, and you can really cut costs. And that's what we've seen. Batteries are going to go down the same route. Electrolyzers are going to go down the same route. It's going to be really, really hard for nuclear to go down the same route, right? We've seen, and if you want to be completely technology neutral, we've seen the same problem with concentrating solar power. Another beautiful, elegant technology which has storage built into renewable energy, but it's really struggled because you need to build really big plants, and you need to invest in them, these really large investments. You do it once, and then you have to learn something and do it again in these really big step forwards, right? And I think that nuclear is always going to struggle with that. Even the small modular reactors are not that small. And I think the costs are just not going to come down in the same way that renewables are. And it's going to be really difficult for them to really shift the dial in Australia. And I'll let everybody else talk about the politics and the social license.
Yeah, I think the nuclear question is really interesting, and the way. So I'm going to tell a bit of a personal story. My mother's got a property up near Bendemeer on the edge of the Northern Tablelands Renewable Energy Zone. She went to a meeting of a group purportedly being about environmentally responsible renewable energy. Walked in the door. It was nothing about that at all, and they were very open once you got in the door. That they were talking about nuclear and literally as a diversion tactic, and literally we just need to divert and slow down and put the stoppers on till we get a change of government. That is a very conscious strategy from vested interests, and that is why nuclear is being talked about so much at the moment.
I 100% agree. I'm going to, I get asked this every time I go on Sky TV because they have to ask you about nuclear every time you go on, and I go on a couple of times a week. They have to ask me about nuclear every time. Why? Because Murdoch loves nuclear. It's a red herring. It's a distraction tactic. But my last answer on nuclear was just have a look at the UK. Almost every nuclear power plant in the UK comes offline by 2028. The UK is walking towards an absolute cliff as all their end-of-life nuclear comes to an end of life. And Hinkley Point is a decade behind schedule. It's 3 times the cost it was meant to be. And it's going to be costing, I don't know, the last figure I saw was £120 per megawatt hour, regulated with 3.5% inflation, indexed legally for 35 years, meaning it is going to cost £200 per megawatt hour over the life. You can do offshore wind in the UK at 50. You could do it at 40. Now it's 50. We've had a 30% cost blowout. It's 50. And by the way, 0 inflation for the next 35 years. It's just ludicrous. But the other point the UK government's just reminded everyone of, they have a $149 billion rehabilitation liability on their nuclear power plants. That's not the waste. That's on decommissioning their nuclear power plants. £10 billion per plant to decommission them, unfunded. There is not a private company in the world that can build nuclear, not one. So when Barnaby Joyce and Ted O'Brien are talking nuclear, they're talking about you funding it. $30 billion a pop of taxpayer money, another NBN, another Snowy Hydro debacle. It'll be a cost blowout that our grandchildren will be paying for, and then we'll have to clean up the mess later. So it's a financial debacle to talk about it in Australia. And I'm not anti-nuclear. The Chinese are building it and they do it all state-owned. They can do it and they do it really cost competitively.
Look, I'm sorry if there are further questions in the room. I'm going to have to wind up there, but I'd like to thank our panel. I think it's been a hugely entertaining and informative session. And thank you for the audience for staying around.